In 1993, inside a U.S. courtroom, a judge stood and said a name no Filipino thought they would ever hear again. It wasn't Ferdinand. It wasn't Imelda. The name was Imee. The judge declared her liable for the death of a student activist. But something strange happened after that. Imee Marcos never went to trial. She never served time in prison. She didn't even show up in court. While a grieving mother buried her son, Imee disappeared from public view. For years, her name was barely spoken. Her story left in silence. But silence didn't end her journey. She came back. Not hiding, not ashamed, but smiling, confident, and more powerful than ever. Today, Imee Marcos sits in the Philippine Senate, passing laws and controlling power. It makes you wonder, how does someone tied to a case like that return to rule again? From a quiet courtroom in Hawaii to the loud Senate floor in Manila, her path tells a chilling truth. If you believe that history always punishes the guilty, this story will make you question that. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover the truth about her marriage, her career, her age, her wealth, and her dynasty. By the end, you'll discover the secret Imee Marcos never admitted and why her silence became her most dangerous weapon. On November 12, 1955, a baby girl was born into one of the most powerful families the Philippines would ever know. Her name was Maria Imelda Josefa Remedios Marcos, but the world would simply call her Imee. She was the first daughter of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, and from the moment she opened her eyes, her world was nothing like yours or mine. She did not grow up on a regular street in a normal neighborhood. Her childhood home was Malacañang Palace, the seat of power, guarded by soldiers covered in gold and crawling with secrets. There were no street games, no noisy neighbors, only long hallways, red carpets, and the weight of a family name that already carried fear and fame. She was just a child, but even before she could speak clearly, her path was already carved. Her future was not her own. She was born to carry the Marcos legacy, whether she wanted it or not. While other kids were laughing and playing, Imee was learning how to walk like a leader, talk like royalty, and act like power itself. She didn't choose the spotlight, but it chose her. And once you are born into that kind of light, you can never step out again. Now, in 2025, Imee Marcos is 69 years old, but that number doesn't tell the full story, because inside her still lives the girl who was raised in a palace, trained for control, and prepared to one day rule. She wasn't just born into power, she was built to hold it, protect it, and never let it go. But what happens when a life like that gets tied to a marriage that shocks the nation? What happens when dynasty meets scandal, and the public watches every move? By the time she turned 26, Imee Marcos had lived her whole life behind palace walls. She had power, she had protection, but now she was about to break the one rule the country didn't allow. In 1981, Imee married Tommy Manotoc, a champion golfer and sports coach. But there was one problem. Tommy had just divorced beauty queen Aurora Pijuan, and he had done it in the Dominican Republic. Back then, divorce was illegal in the Philippines. No one could get away with it. But the Marcos name changed everything. Their wedding shocked the country. People whispered, church leaders raised eyebrows, reporters asked questions, but no one stopped it. Because this wasn't just any bride. This was the dictator's daughter. The scandal faded, the cameras moved on, and soon, Imee and Tommy had 3 sons, Fernando Martin, Ferdinand Richard Michael, and Matthew Joseph. For a while, it looked like a normal family. But nothing around Imee ever stayed normal for long. Years later, their marriage ended quietly, without noise, without headlines. And then came another twist. She began a long, silent relationship with businessman Mark Chua, a name rarely mentioned but always close. In Imee's world, even love stories were wrapped in power and secrecy. While other women followed rules, she rewrote them. While others got punished, she walked free. Her personal life showed something deeper. This dynasty didn't just survive the law. It could bend it. It could reshape it. And it never had to explain itself. But the real question was never just about love. It was about something bigger. How could someone with this much scandal rise into real politics? What made the public forget and let her return to power? By 1984, the Marcos regime had ruled the Philippines for nearly 2 decades. Fear controlled the streets. Silence filled the schools. But inside the halls of government, a new name appeared. Imee Marcos was appointed as an assemblywoman in the Batasang Pambansa, It was her first real position in politics. But this wasn't earned. It wasn't because of votes or merit. It came by inheritance. She was the daughter of a dictator, and the system bent to serve her. While brave Filipinos were out protesting, while students were jailed, beaten, or disappeared, Imee was seated in power. She wore the clothes of democracy, but the public knew the truth. To many, she was a symbol of privilege, untouched by pain. A face that smiled while the country suffered. Even as the nation groaned under martial law, she moved freely through its halls. She wasn't just watching history, she was sitting inside it. But history doesn't stay quiet forever. By 1986, the people had enough. The crowds filled the streets. The shouting grew louder, the signs rose higher, and then the Marcos Empire collapsed. The family packed their bags. The palace gates were left behind. The country cheered. The dictator had fallen. The dynasty was broken. But one question hung in the air. What happened to Imee, the daughter of power, the face of control? Where did she go when the lights in Malacanang went dark? What happens when a life built on rule and silence is forced into exile? In 1986, the streets of Manila exploded with anger. The people rose. The palace fell. The Marcos family fled the country, escorted by U.S. helicopters, leaving power behind. Their new home wasn't a palace. It was exile in Hawaii. For the first time, the Marcoses were outside the walls that had protected them for decades. Their empire was gone, their image shattered, and in the quiet that followed, a storm began to form. In 1993, inside a U.S. courtroom, Imee's name returned to the spotlight. She was found liable for the wrongful death of Archimedes Trajano, a student activist who had dared to question her. Trajano's death had long been buried in fear. Now, it was back. The court delivered its ruling, but Imee didn't fight. She didn't speak. She didn't even show up. While her parents defended themselves in public, Imee chose silence. No interviews, no comments, just quiet. And somehow, that silence worked. It shielded her. It hid her scars. It became her survival strategy. The ruling could have ended her career forever, but it didn't. Because the world kept turning. The headlines moved on, and Imee remained in the shadows, waiting for the day she could step back into the light. While others shouted, she stayed still. While others begged for forgiveness, she gave none. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was a weapon. But one question refused to go away. How could she ever return to Philippine politics after something like this? By the late 1990s, the Marcos name still carried shame in many parts of the Philippines. But in the north, something strange was happening. Imee Marcos returned. She didn't arrive quietly. She came with a plan, not to defend the past, but to rewrite the present. In 1998, she ran for representative of Ilocos Norte. She won. Then in 2010, she became the governor of the province. And she ruled there for nearly 2 decades. 20 years of power. 20 years of silence. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She offered roads, projects, festivals, and results. People began to call her the Queen of the North. In Ilocos, she wasn't a dictator's daughter. She was a leader who got things done. The shadows of the past were still there, but she didn't look back. She kept moving forward, fast, sharp, and focused. Her survival wasn't about saying sorry. It was about working harder than anyone else around her. She didn't seek redemption through confession. She found it through rebranding. The Marcos name was no longer just about exile and corruption. It was now tied to bridges, hospitals, and school programs. She gave voters what they could see and touch, and they gave her something back: trust. For 2 full decades, she held her ground. But the question kept rising. Could she go further? Was she ready to step beyond Ilocos Norte? Could her new image survive on the national stage, under the spotlight of history, critics, and cameras? In 2019, something happened that once felt impossible. Imee Marcos won a seat in the Philippine Senate. She stepped into the heart of power, a chamber built to protect democracy. But that same democracy had once been broken by her father's rule. Now his daughter stood among its lawmakers. She was no longer a name from exile. She was no longer a story from the past. She was a senator of the Republic. Part of the 19th Congress, she now had the power to write and shape the very laws of the land, laws her father once crushed. The irony was loud, but Imee didn't blink. She sat tall in the red halls of government. She didn't come back as a shadow. She came back as a symbol of return. By 2022, her brother Bongbong Marcos had become the president of the Philippines. The Marcos name wasn't just surviving. It was ruling again. The dynasty was complete. The daughter who once hid behind silence now held a microphone. The family that fled in shame now stood in victory. There were no apologies, no public reckonings, only new titles, new offices, and new power. And the country watched. Some in shock, some in silence, some in full support. But one question remained. She writes laws now. She shapes the future. But what about her wealth? What does a lifetime inside palaces, exile, and politics actually look like? On paper. What does Imee Marcos truly hold? In money, in land, in power that doesn't wear a name tag. In 2020, Imee Marcos submitted her official statement of assets, liabilities, and net worth, known as the SALN. The number was surprising. She declared just 36.27 million pesos, or about $700,000. That's a small number for a name that once ruled a nation. On paper, Imee Marcos is a millionaire, but barely. Nothing close to the billions many expected. And yet, the story doesn't end with that number. Because over the years, the Philippine Commission on Good Government, PCGG, has recovered more than 170 billion pesos in Marcos-linked wealth. That's more than $3 billion. And they're still looking. For decades, banks, accounts, and offshore holdings have been traced back to the Marcos name. The wealth is legendary. But Imee's records stay modest. Her lifestyle is quiet, her numbers controlled. So the question grows louder. Is she really just a millionaire? Or the public face of something far larger, far deeper, and far more protected? She never brags. She never breaks character. And she never gives answers about the past. Because for Imee, wealth was never her loudest weapon. Her real power was something else. Something stronger than gold. Because while people chase money, she mastered influence. And while others look for billions, Imee looks for control. If not wealth, then what is the secret that makes her truly untouchable? Today, Imee Marcos sits in the Senate, one of the most powerful lawmakers in the country. Her brother Bongbong Marcos is the president of the Philippines. Her sons are rising in politics, building their own careers under the same name. The Marcos dynasty, once chased out of the country, now controls it again. It sounds impossible, but it's real. The family that once ruled, fell, and vanished never really disappeared. From Ferdinand to Bongbong to Imee, the line has never been broken. For more than 50 years, the name Marcos has stayed close to power. The world watched them fall, but somehow they rose again. So now the question is no longer where are they? It's how did they come back? Was this just survival or the quiet rebirth of an empire? And in the middle of it all is Imee. Silent, smiling, steady. She doesn't explain the past. She doesn't answer the critics. She just keeps moving. While others fight to be heard, she wins by saying nothing. Her power comes not from noise, but from control. And that control never left. She doesn't need speeches. She doesn't need defense because she knows something others don't. Empires don't end in flames. Sometimes they just learn how to whisper. And now the silence is louder than ever. So what is the secret weapon that let Imee Marcos outlast revolutions, courtrooms, exile, and time itself? Imee Marcos's greatest weapon was never her voice. It was her silence. While the world shouted, she stood still. While the courts ruled, she stayed quiet. And while history roared with pain, she vanished, then returned stronger. In a world obsessed with noise, headlines, and confessions, she made absence her shield. No speeches, no apologies, just a steady climb back to power. She didn't rewrite history. She waited for history to forget. Because sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it just waits. From exile to empire, she didn't fight to be remembered. She fought to be unforgettable by doing nothing at all. In 1993, a court said she was guilty. In 2025, she writes the laws. That is the story. That is the twist. Silence outlived justice. So ask yourself this. If silence can survive a courtroom, if silence can rebuild a dynasty, then what happens to truth? And who really wins when no one says a word? This isn't just the story of Imee Marcos. It's the story of a dynasty that refused to die. A family that proved something terrifying. History is never final. You've seen it all. Her marriage, her career, her age, her wealth, her legacy, all woven together into one long, unbroken chain of power. From palaces to courtrooms, from exile to empire, she didn't need noise. She used silence, and somehow it worked. If this story made you see power differently, subscribe now for more untold stories of the world's most powerful families. We bring you truth, layer by layer, story by story. But now we ask you the final question. Is Imee Marcos just a survivor of history? Or is she proof that history can be rewritten by silence? Let us know in the comments. The story isn't over.